So good afternoon, good evening. I apologize that I would have liked to have met with you all earlier and talked a little bit earlier with you about the situation of the call that we were on last night. However, there was a lot of moving parts. There still is. I want to preface this. This is still the early stages of an investigation. We're not even 24 hours in, and there were a lot of things that I wanted to do. Anytime that you have an officer-involved shooting, there's a lot of pieces, health and welfare of the individual that is suffered the gunshots, talking with the officers, family members. That matters to me. Our Commonwealth Attorney, had several conversations with our mayor and city manager. Was able to go up to the hospital today. We'll talk a little bit about that. That's just important to me when we talk about the totality of everything. So you should have got the press release last night. My attempt today is not to dwell too far into the case. This still has to be investigated. There's a lot more interviews that will take place in partnership with our Commonwealth Attorney. But what I did want to try to provide is a little bit of a timeline, a time frame of what occurred last night, what our response was, where we're at today, and then what will take place in the future. I'll take a few questions, but again, I just preface, bear with me. I can't go, there's still an investigation ongoing, but I do believe it's important for us to be as transparent, and that's the line I'm going to try to walk today. Fair enough?
Yes.
Okay. All right, so the timeline for the incident, the incident last night, an officer-involved shooting in the 600 block of Cleveland Avenue. This did take part in an apartment complex, sort of under a pull-in parking garage, if you will, and the vehicle was parked there. At 8:01 last night, a call was received by our dispatch center. The caller advised that I think it's spelled Jean, but it's pronounced John Alcindor. 42-year-old adult male is not sounding like himself, and he's conveying suicidal tendencies. The caller stated that John may have some drug issues and feels that he may have overdosed in reference to a suicide. Now that's the information that came to dispatch and is transmitted to officers. That is coming from a family member. But that's the information that officers are receiving at the time of the call. At 8:04, after the information was obtained, the call was dispatched to our officers. So at that point, officers were dispatched as well as medics. Around 8:09, medics arrived in the area and they were staged in a safe location, and officers arrived and began to interact around 8:13. The first two officers there on the scene. The officers were able, about 8:14, to confirm that the subject was armed, and that he did have a possession of a firearm. At 8:15, officers heard one gunfire, one gunshot, one round go off inside of a vehicle as they set up and established a perimeter and tried to gain contact with the individual. Now there is a time between about 8:13 and 9:39 that officers are seeing movement inside the vehicle. They do see the individual inside the vehicle that we believe to be Jean or John. I'm going to call him Mr. Alcindor, so to help with a little bit of the pronunciation. But between the time frame of 8:13 and 9:39, officers see the subject moving around inside the vehicle, drinking alcohol, and in the possession of a firearm. Officers began negotiating by phone and talking with the subject about 8:49. So it took a little bit of time to try to get him to answer his phone, to get a number for him, and to have some back and forth, some communication. The individual that was leading that communication was an officer who was actually on the street working, but they're also on our negotiating team that works hand in hand with our SWAT team. So those type calls are trying to find what the situation is and trying to de-escalate, and that's important. You'll hear me talk about that a few more times as we go forward in this situation. The subject remained in the vehicle during the negotiations as his conversations were going on. Now between that time frame, 8:13 to 9:39, they see movement in the vehicle. They're able to see him. Officers begin negotiating by phone about 8:49 is the time we started having conversations. So this is important. One of the concerns when we have a long-standing situation is what are the elements, right? Are they exposed to rain or snow? The temperatures last night were in the low 30s, and that's a concern of mine. One of the first things I did when I was notified was kind of look at the time, and then what is the temperature outside that I have officers exposed to the elements. At 9:39, the SWAT team was activated. And when I say that, that means there was a SWAT team called out, and they staged a location to start to put a plan together to address the situation. And I'm also cognizant of how long the officers have been out in this weather. At 10:29, the subject exited the vehicle with a firearm in his hands, and you hear an officer say, "I'm not going to do that. He said for me to shoot him. I'm not going to do that." At 10:30, officer yells several commands numerous times to drop the firearm. You'll hear phrases, or we hear phrases of drop the firearm, put it down, please stop, put the gun down. And that's about 10:30 p.m. The subject is walking directly towards the officers at this time. This is still around 10:30, with the gun in his hand. About 10:30 and 30 seconds, or 32 seconds, the subject is within close proximity of the officers and fires a round. A few seconds pass, about 10:30 and 49 seconds. Another round is fired, moving in the direction of the officers. The officers replied, "Do not point the gun at me." So after this second round is fired outside of the vehicle, the individual continues to walk towards the officers, looking at them, and starts to move the gun in their direction, and you hear the officer say, "Don't point the gun at me." The officer replies, "Don't point the gun at me," and a third round is fired at this point, once the struggle begins. So because of close proximity, one of the officers was able to reach out and make contact with the individual who had the firearm, and you start to see a struggle begin. The gun as that struggle goes on, a third round goes off. That's the third round that I'm talking about. And then a fourth round is fired, which strikes one of our officers in his department-issued Taser that is carried on his duty belt. At that point, officers return fire, and our victim is struck 2 times. The same officers that are involved in the shooting immediately begin to provide medical attention to the individual who suffered a gunshot wounds, I should say. And, so at this point, medics are called in. As officers are taking life-saving measures, medics are called in, and they begin to take over the medical treatment. The individual is loaded then into the ambulance. They begin to give care for the victim. He's taken into the ambulance and transported to a nearby hospital where he's undergoing treatment. So a lot of things at this point happen now as we bring in forensics to process the crime scene, to photograph the crime scene. We're canvassing the neighborhood, talking to individuals. There were several individuals when I got there that I saw that were outside that I believe possibly heard or saw something. Detectives did that well and through the night and even into this morning. We came back here. We brought the officers that were involved back here to headquarters, and our protocol is first to make sure that they are okay. I notified again my city manager and the mayor last night and late last night, early into the morning. In the holiday season, one of the things we always talk about is individuals that may be struggling through some things. You never know what's going on inside someone's life, and whatever those feelings may be, and if you induce that with alcohol, depression, remember the call came in of a loved one that talked about suicidal tendencies, all those things, the totality of what the situation is. I'm thankful that none of the officers were injured. I spent time with them. We were here till about 5 this morning. I spent time with them and talked with them myself. This morning, detectives met with the Commonwealth Attorney. They were also notified, and they sat down and had some discussions. I don't want to go into the questions, and I was not present for that. But that's our standard protocol when we're investigating a police-involved shooting. I talked again with the mayor this morning and afternoon, as well as our city manager. And I did reach out to each of the officers again this afternoon and checking on them. I also was able to reach out to the wife of the individual that's at the hospital. We had a short conversation, and I told her that she matters to me, and I just wanted to check on her. And then myself and Chief Grinstead went to the hospital to check on Mr. Alcindor. I needed to see him for myself. I was able to talk to a nurse there, and I did not go in the room, but I did put eyes on him directly. That matters to me. He matters to me. Whatever situation or he was going through, it's regretful that this happened, and then to inject a firearm in that even makes things worse. But I would describe him as critical but stable. Critical but stable. So we went through a litany. Chief Creswell stayed at the scene for a while to make sure it was processed correctly. They had everything in place there, that we have detectives here. We had support staff. I did call our department psychologist by phone and have a conversation with him. There was evidence recovered at the scene, including the firearm. And hats off to the officers. There were several things, several times that the officers tried to de-escalate. Please put the gun down. We don't want to hurt you. Don't make me do this. There were several comments, numerous times, whether on the phone before he got out of the vehicle or after, when it becomes a much more dangerous situation. So I'm thankful that everyone made it. And we're not talking about some other scenarios here today. So at this point, I'll try to take a few questions, but please remember, we're not even 24 hours into this case, and I don't want to jeopardize anything that now it is ongoing as we start to prepare the case and interviews and turn over to the Commonwealth Attorney. Does anybody have any questions?
Yes. Is the suspect facing any charges?
So that's a great question. The suspect is facing some charges. I just met with the detectives before he came down. Basically, we're looking at that we'll be facing gun and drug charges, 3 attempts of malicious wounding, and 3 counts of the use of a firearm in the commission of a felony. There were 3 officers there that were primarily had the interaction once he exited the vehicle.
But not attempted murder of a police officer.
So right now, again, we're in the early stages. We talked a little bit about the scenario, but there's still some interviews. That's a great question. There's still some interviews that need to be conducted, and we're looking at the totality of what was going on, and we'll allow the Commonwealth Attorney to make that decision as we work with them. But when you look at the totality of what we have, those are the charges that we're facing right now. But like I said, there's still some individuals that need to be interviewed, and what all was going on in that situation.
Did this take place outside of the parking lot or under the, I think I'm familiar with that parking lot.
Yes.
Were they inside, under the?
No, it was the individual, the car was parked in, I guess I would call it a bay, or the parking lot, I guess, if you would, both sides of an overhang, but he had gotten out and coming around, and it took place out in the open.
Did he live there?
He lived in that area, yes, ma'am.
And were the body cameras on for the officers?
They were.
All 3 of them?
Yes, ma'am.
So the first 3 rounds that he fired, those were not in the direction of the officers, only the fourth one?
So the first round, we know that there was a round fired inside the vehicle. Then the individual exits the vehicle and begins to walk towards the officers. They clearly see the firearm in his hand, and they continue to, please put the gun down, please put the gun down, don't do this. There's a round fired, and then a second round fired as he continues to advance, as he looks at the officers and fires a weapon.
But he's firing it not in their direction?
So the first 2 rounds were not in their direction, but close proximity, very close proximity.
Did he have any mental, cognitive issues going on?
So we'll start doing the background on that. I'm hoping to work a little bit with the family. I hope that the detectives will be able to have some conversations with him. I don't want to I don't know what's going on inside someone's mind, as the officers did either, right? But we do know that the call that we received from a loved one talked about possible suicidal tendencies. We talked about some possible drug use that may have been involved. We certainly know that he was using alcohol and had a firearm. And some of the comments that were made there certainly were extremely concerning. I thought the officers used a great deal amount of restraint. The situation that they were faced in that close proximity, a great deal of restraint.
I know earlier this year we reported that you guys have the mobile crisis teams. Were these officers a part of the mobile crisis teams?
So just a little bit over half of our department is trained in what we call critical incident training. But the mobile crisis teams, or the care unit, I think that you're referring to, which deals with a paramedic and a clinician, we would not deploy them if there's a violent And I would not, those are civilians, right? I would not deploy them in a situation where a firearm was used, a firearm has already been fired, or there's the potential for danger, so I would not have used them in this situation. The individual having those conversations is part of our negotiators team. It was an officer that was working on the street, so to be able to have her respond and take over those conversations through the phone within about 30 minutes was a plus for us.
Chief, I just want to be clear that the subject's wounds were from the police firearms?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And then, was this a situation where we could have deployed Marcus Alert? How does that work when you're dealing with
Sure.
response?
So again, the Marcus Alert, as we talk about our care team, that's responding, it's a lower level response to individuals that may be suffering some type of mental crisis, but we would not put civilian in harm's way. So because that there's a firearm that we already know of, this is not a system that I would have injected them in, and then a round is fired while we're inside that vehicle. I don't want them to be in harm's way. So it's for a lower level where we're not seeing an act of violence, if that makes sense. Even when we deploy our CARES unit to address individuals that may be going through a mental crisis, whether it's suicidal, depression, drug addiction, whatever it might be, in any scenario, officers are still going to those calls as well, but we're kind of becoming the second responders. And if something becomes violent, or if a weapon is displayed, or some type of threats are made, then we would become the first responders. We didn't really have that ability at this point. With the call that we had gotten, the tendencies that were laid out, concerns by his significant other, right? And because a round had already been discharged in that vehicle, we would not have used that in this situation.
And the officers are placed on administrative leave? How does that work?
Yep, so every officer that was there at the scene was brought here last night. The three, those that fired, and the third officer that were there together, those will all be on administrative leave. We did some of that paperwork this morning, but they were conveyed that last night. The others will evaluate. I want them to talk to our department psychologist. That's just to make sure in those situations, things that they see in today's 21st century policing, I think that's a benefit to have. So that will take place, and we'll get those appointments scheduled as we move forward. You know, I'm also concerned about, you know, what they were exposed to, going home to their families. But all the way around, that's the reason I went to the hospital myself today with Chief Grinstead to put my eyes on Mr. Alcindor.
How many rounds did they fire?
I don't want to go into the exact count of officers' rounds. I can tell you the individual was struck twice. I would consider he went to surgery. They were considered life-threatening, but he did come through surgery, and he is listed in critical. I want to make sure I say it right: critical but stable condition.
Can you share where he was shot?
No, I'd rather not get into that. I don't want to hurt the Commonwealth. You know, it's a fine line. I want to be as transparent as I can, but I also don't want to jeopardize the case as they go forward. And one of the reasons that is when we talk to witnesses, we may want to ask that, and I don't want to prejudice anyone by comments that I would say here.
Just to clarify, the officers were shot at but not shot.
So one officer, so again, we talked about the rounds inside the vehicle and then outside as he approached. We talked about another round during a struggle to try to get the firearm, and then the fourth round while outside the vehicle, which is actually the fifth round, right, struck the officer's taser that's on his gun belt. So by the grace of God, he was not struck in his body, but on the department-issued taser that he had on his gun belt. And then when that happened, that's when officers returned fire, and our individual suffered 2 gunshot wounds.
Did all 3 officers return fire, or just 2?
So we did round counts. I don't want to get into that. I can tell you that, again, I don't want to jeopardize that case. Those individuals need to be interviewed. The Commonwealth Attorney is going to want them to be interviewed in a case. We're going to investigate this just like we would any shooting. There's no special treatment. So I'm not going to put that information out. I'm going to let the detectives gain that from interviews. We believe we know what that number is already, but I can tell you that the individual was struck twice, and then went to surgery last night and is through surgery. And like I said, I got to see him today.
And Chief, just spell his name one more time. The subject.
Yes, ma'am. We'll make that. We'll give that to you. It's spelled Jean, and from what I understand, it's pronounced John, but it is spelled Jehn, and his last name is Alcindor. You're going to test it. I believe it's Alcindor. and he is 42.
And how are the police officers?
You know, nobody in this profession ever wants to have to be called to use deadly force. The things I saw, the measure they took, and the measure they took to try to de-escalate before that had to occur was just extraordinary. Extraordinary. They were definitely within harm's way. So it was incumbent upon me in the 30 years I've been doing this, before I allowed them to leave this building, I met with each one of them, not to interview them about the case. That is the detectives, just like they would any case, and the Commonwealth Attorney's, at the Commonwealth Attorney's direction is how they investigate it and go forward. For me, talking to them was about making sure that I could pillow my head this morning when most of us left here, and making sure that they were okay. I also reached out to some of their family members to talk to them. And that's the reason why I called each of them this afternoon before this press conference. I owed them that to check on them. But you can imagine, I'm concerned about the dispatcher who dispatched the call. I'm concerned about, you have officers that believe one of their fellow officers was struck by gunfire and was down. All those things play a role. So, and there's a bond, right? And law enforcement and the military, individuals who work close together, and in situations like that, it's like a brotherhood, a family. So we'll be taking some precautions. I was talking to Chief Grinstead and Chief Creswell earlier today. I reached out to Chief Hires last night and this morning. I want to make sure that those roll calls, those officers that come to work every day with those same officers, that they're okay, that our dispatchers are okay, that they had to, as they work in close proximity and dispatch calls. And think about a dispatcher who's hearing this coming in, but they can't see it, right? So I just need to make sure that they're okay, that they come back when we're ready for them to come back after the investigation's concluded. The Commonwealth Attorney makes their decision, their ruling, in the totality of what we have. But the officers that are still showed up today, those same officers who worked with the individuals that were involved in this incident last night are working today. I need to make sure that they're all right. So we rely on our training, we rely on our sergeants and lieutenants to have conversations with them, to check on them. They know them better than anyone else. Also, there were several lieutenants that came to the scene and came here with their officers, not to get involved in the investigation, but to just check on them to make sure that they're okay. And that was a big part of what we did last night after first processing the crime scene, getting medical attention to who needed medical attention, counting rounds, all those things that we do, because the numbers that responded, we're still going to go through this process just like it was any other shooting, and turn the case over to the Commonwealth Attorney for their decision.
Were these patrol officers or SWAT team members?
No, these were all patrol officers that were working and responded to a individual that was portrayed to us, was going through a crisis, and they responded and did exactly what I would expect them to do, to try to gain open lines of communication and de-escalate the situation, let him know that people cared about him and were concerned about him, and just to leave the gun in the car, come out, and let's get you some help and treatment that we can. So they were just officers doing what we do every day. It goes to the adage we always say, you never know what call you're going to get. So if we don't have any other questions, I'm going to leave it at that. I appreciate you guys. I wanted to get with you earlier today, but I owed it to the family of the officers themselves, and Mr. Alcindor, who's at the hospital. I wanted to take time and spend a little bit of time with him and check on him as well. Okay?